Alright, so this video lecture is just going to be a kind of a quick overview of perfect competition, which is going to be the first market structure that we look at in detail. Now, the thing to note about perfectly competitive markets is that when we're observing the real world, we're very, very unlikely to find any particular market that perfectly resembles a perfectly competitive market. So then the question becomes, well, why are we going to spend so much time studying perfect competition? And the answer is because it kind of gives us an ideal, it gives us something by which to compare all other market structures. So we can imagine what it's like for a what a market would be like if it were perfectly competitive. And then we're going to look at the real world and say, well, why don't markets resemble perfect competition, and see what that means for the firms in those markets. So a perfectly competitive market is one in which the decisions of individual buyers and sellers do not affect the market as a whole. So there's going to be no ability for any one consumer, one purchaser, one buyer, or a single firm within that market to do anything that's going to have an impact on the entire market. And in such a market structure, a perfectly competitive market, we say that firms become price takers. We'll see how in some other market structures how firms are going to be price seekers, where they do have a little bit of control over what price they charge. But under perfect competition, the market itself, the interaction of the buyers and sellers, will determine the price, and then the firm is going to be, faced with a decision to either accept that price or not. So there's four primary characteristics of a perfectly competitive market. The first is that there has to be a large number of both buyers and sellers. And the reason being that if there aren't very many buyers or there aren't very many sellers, then you may have a situation in which one buyer or seller can do something to affect the entire market. So with a sufficiently large number of buyers and sellers, no individual buyer or seller can move the market. The second characteristic is that in that market, the product that's being produced has to be homogeneous, or in other words, it means that the products across firms are indistinguishable. So every firm that's in that market is producing the exact same product as every other firm, which means that one firm's product is a perfect substitute for all of the other firms' products. So if we're looking at a widget market, that means that every widget company is producing an identical widget. You can't tell one from another. The third major characteristic is that everybody in the market has to have access to all relevant information. So both buyers and sellers have to know everything about what's going on in that market. So they both have to know who each other are. They have to know all about what it takes to make the product, where they're being sold. They need to have access to all information. There's no secrets in a perfectly competitive market. And then finally, the last characteristic is that there are no barriers to either entry or exit in this market. So that means that there's nothing that prevents new firms from getting into the market, and there's nothing that prevents firms from leaving if they choose. So that's our characteristics of a perfectly competitive market. Large number of buyers and sellers, product homogeneity, perfect information, and no barriers to entry or exit. And so what we'll do in later market structures is start to ask, well, what happens if any of those characteristics are not met? And we'll see how that changes things. So like I said a minute ago, the market itself, the interaction of buyers and sellers, is going to determine the price. And so what we'll see is that once the market has settled at some equilibrium, there's going to be one price that everybody in the market has to pay or accept. And what we'll do in class on Saturday is we're going to take another look at the short-run cost structure for a firm, and we'll imagine that it's a perfectly competitive firm, and so we're going to see how the price that the market sets is going to interact with the short-run cost structure for the firm. Because remember, at the end of the day, a firm is trying to maximize profit, and we find profit by taking total revenues minus total cost. So one way a firm can figure out what their profit maximizing level of output will be to look at the market and see, okay, what price is the market willing to pay me for my product? What are my total costs, whether I produce 1 unit or 1,000,000 units? And so at every level of output, you know your total revenue, your total cost, and you simply subtract the two, and then you just look for the level of output where the profit is at its maximum. All right, so that's one way a firm will sit down and figure out how it will maximize its profit. But another way to do this is by marginal analysis. So you may remember that we talked about this before with the example of utility. So as I'm sitting down and I'm eating one more cookie, I'm trying to think about the marginal benefit I get from eating one more cookie versus the marginal cost. And you may recall that we will continue to eat cookies up until the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost of the last cookie. In other words, producing or eating that last cookie doesn't make me any better or worse off. The same concept is going to apply to a firm. A firm, every time it sells another unit, is going to earn some marginal revenue, but then every time it produces that additional unit, it's going to incur a marginal cost. So as long as the marginal revenue of producing one more unit outweighs the marginal cost, it would make sense for the firm to produce that additional unit. And they will continue in this fashion until they reach some level of output where the marginal revenue of that last unit is perfectly offset by the marginal cost of producing that last unit. And so as we'll see, the profit maximizing condition for a firm is going to be that it produces up to the point, it produces output up until the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. And so again, we'll go through this with some mathematical and graphical exercises in class. Now the other thing to consider, and again we'll look at this with the graphical mathematical analysis, is that firm at some point may have to decide whether it's profitable to stay open, to stay in business, or whether it may need to shut down for a period of time, or whether it may need to just entirely leave the market. And so what we'll notice is that a firm will continue to produce so long as the price that it receives is equal to the minimum average total cost. So remember, average total cost is the cost per unit. So as long as the price it receives perfectly offsets the cost, the average cost per unit, it'll make sense for the firm to continue producing. Now, if the price falls below that minimum average total cost, now they're going to be experiencing losses, right? It's going to be costing them more per unit than they receive per unit. The question then becomes, well, do we stay in business or do we shut down? And you might think it doesn't make sense to stay in business when the price is less than the cost per unit. But what we're going to see in the graphical analysis is that as long as the price is above the average variable cost, then the firm will stay in business. And the thinking is that if you can receive a price per unit that is at least able to cover your variable costs, so this is the electricity, the supplies, the wages of your workers, right? As long as you can make just enough money to pay for those variable costs, it will make sense to stay in business. Now, if the price falls below the average variable cost, well, now what we're going to say is that the firm has reached a shutdown price. This means that you aren't receiving enough dollars per unit to even pay the workers or the electricity or the supplies to produce that level of output. And again, we're going to look at this in detail with the graphical analysis. So we'll identify the break-even price, where they're just making enough to cover their costs, and then we'll compare that with the shutdown price, at which point they would close shop and wait until the price rises again. So that's just a general overview. Hopefully you've been looking at the study guides and gone through some of the practice problems. The OpenStax text should do a really good job of explaining this in much more detail. And so when we meet tomorrow, we will go over the graphical and mathematical analysis just to demonstrate these concepts. And we'll see that the same process is going to apply for all of the other market structures. It's just in those cases we are not meeting all of those criteria to form a perfectly competitive market. So we're going to again see, all right, well, if we don't have many buyers, many sellers, or if we don't have, or if there are barriers to entry and exit, what does that mean for the market structure? What does it mean for the firms that are operating in that market?